I want to give you my, first, before I talk, I want to give you my philosophy on time. I do. I have a philosophy on most things. It's a problem that I live with. I learned this really from the profession that I'm in, and my producer Alan Estrin, who is here, can certainly testify to this. We ask each other after each 3-hour show, did it go fast? If it went fast, it was a good show. If it didn't go fast, we're in trouble. For you, the listener, it has to go fast. So I have a view on time as I do on money. If I buy an item at an incredible bargain at $4.99, but I don't use it, then I have totally wasted $4.99. But if I buy an item for $499 and constantly use it, it was a great deal. That's how I look at money. Am I getting the best, and will I use it? And same thing with time. Is the time being used well? Or am I bored out of my mind, as sitter baseball, as I mentioned last night, was a feature of my upbringing. I was bored in our services. So my view is, if we are inspiring you musically, emotionally, Jewishly, and intellectually, then the time is worthwhile. So that's my view on how long a Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur service is. It's very touching that the cantor asked for those who were struggling with faith to come up and say the bracha over the Torah. I'll tell you why it's interesting on a number of grounds. First, I don't know of another religion that would do that. It's hard for me to imagine that in a typical church, I may be wrong, but I've been to a number of church services. All those of you struggling with the divinity of Jesus, please come up right now and make a blessing. They may say if you're struggling, come up and receive him, but that's very different. I can't imagine that at a mosque they're saying, if you are not sure whether Gabriel, the angel Gabriel, recited the Quran to Muhammad, please step up. I mean, there might be mosques in Syria, or I should say Saudi Arabia, where they say that, but I don't think they'd step up. It's really, we are, as many of you may know, as anybody involved in Jewish life, we have problems with our fellow Jews. Every one of us does, in whatever way. It stems from Moses. He had a lot of problems. God has a lot of problems with us. But it's worth saying to our credit, that struggling with God is a very powerful and uniquely Jewish notion. I was reading a book. I finished a book recently, The Closing of the Muslim Mind, which was very, very powerful. A scholar on Islam, and it's not anti-Islam, it's just answering the question that so many have asked, what has happened? There were days of glory in Islamic history, what happened? And his theory is, what happened is a war was made on reason. The Mutazilites, who believed in reason, were overthrown in the 10th century, and the Asharites took over, and they said that reason has no place in religion, only revelation, not reason. And that caused some terrible developments in Islam, and that's the theory of this man. And I realized, my God, look at how basic it is to any Jew that Abraham fought with God. It's the first story, the first monotheist fights with God. That's Jewish. And what I want to talk to you about is God, and that, remember, a lot of Jews forget fighting with God is good, not believing isn't good. It isn't. It doesn't mean you're bad. There are wonderful atheists and there are miserable believers. Everybody knows that. But it isn't Jewish not to believe in God. Does that mean that you're not Jewish? No, it doesn't. You can't be read out of the Jewish people no matter what you do. So don't worry about that. I'm not reading you out. I'm saying that Judaism has demands. If a religion doesn't have demands, it's not a religion. It's a feel-good operation. Judaism says definitely struggle with God. Yisrael, Israel means struggle with God, but don't ignore God. It's Elie Wiesel's one of his famous lines. And the problem, he said, is not that Jews fight with God. I do, Wiesel says, it's that Jews ignore God. That's what's happened, and most Jews do ignore God. But God is the ultimate issue. And what I want to deal with you on this Rosh Hashanah, having explained that this is God's day, as it were, of all our holidays, this is God Day. I want to deal with, instead of arguments for God's existence, and I'd be happy to do that, and I will at another time perhaps, I want to take all the objections that I have heard. And I think, and I've heard many, because I debated Christopher Hitchens and what is Harris's first name? Sam Harris. I debated all the leading atheists except for the one in Britain. Well, Hitchens is also partially British. Who's the one? Dawkins. Yeah, he didn't come on the show. But in any event, I have done this. It's on the internet. You can watch it. And I know what the objections are, and I know what many of you encounter. So I want to do two things. I want to answer the normal objections to belief in God that are given, and then tell you why I think a lot of my fellow Jews don't believe. I think there are reasons that are not articulated as well as the articulated. Let me go through 4 articulated. Number 1, how can I believe in God with all the unjust suffering in the world? People will raise the Holocaust as the primary example, but you surely don't mean the Holocaust. And let me tell you that I believe this to be the toughest issue. Of course it's the toughest issue. This world is permeated by injustice. It just is. It could start at birth. You could get stuck with very, very bad parents. You can, right? I often think of when you have, dog adoption, and I think, some lucky dog's going to get a great couple, and some dog's going to get a lousy couple with a kid who puts firecrackers in the dog's, anal cavity. And I know, that happens, and you realize it's all a matter of luck. If the dog goes to family X, he's the luckiest creature in the world. He goes to family Y, he's a dead duck. But that's true for us. That's exactly true for us, where you get to go. So you start out life, it's not fair or fair. If it's great, it's not fair, you've gotten too much good. If it's bad, you've got too much bad. In either case, it's unfair. Everything, life is permeated with unfairness and injustice. So what is Judaism's answer? I adore Judaism's answer because it's not emotionally satisfying, but I find it intellectually satisfying. To be honest, my wife does not. This is a rare area of difference between us. She does not find this satisfying. She's wrong, but she just doesn't find it satisfying. And that is this. The book of Job. There's a good example, by the way. Our Bible, I'm so proud of it. It has this whole issue of, there's a lot of unjust suffering, and it's even made worse. God inflicts it on Job. And then, let's see if Job will still be a believer with all the suffering. Anyway, his friends tell him, it's because you've done bad or don't believe in God. He rejects his friend's advice. But finally, at the end, he has questions to God. And God answers him basically as follows. Where were you, Job? If you know so much, where were you when I created the world? If you know so much, which one of us makes sure that a mother bear takes care of her cubs? Job, if you know so much, tell me, which one of us makes sure that an eagle makes the nest up on high? In other words, Job, you don't know anything. You're a human. And I find that to be utterly satisfying intellectually. There's a medieval Jewish phrase, Lu yadati v'hayiti, if I knew him, I would be him. We don't know, we just don't know. Why do I love this? I admire Judaism for its intellectual honesty. Because what I can't stand is pablum. I have no problem with I don't know. I can't stand pablum. And neither can you. What is Judaism going to say? Well, it's really because how much bad you've done. But you know and I know that there's no correlation between goodness and suffering. None. Tzaddik v'ralo v'rasha v'tovlo is one of the basic questions of Judaism. The tzaddik, the good man, has it awful, and the bad man has it good. And that's true. That is true. There's clearly no justice. Of course, the Eastern religions have their answer. You suffer in this life because of the way you acted in the last life. Now, I happen to have a great deal of respect for Buddhism. I, in fact, studied it in England, and under a Buddhist professor, and I learned a lot. But I must say, that particular answer does not satisfy me at all, intellectually or morally. So in other words, so all the 6 million were really bad guys in the last life? And if I believe that, then why would I have pity on some baby suffering now? He was Hitler in the last life. So I've never, and I'm not mocking it. I'm telling you, Buddhism has produced brilliance. One of the basic attitudes of my life, not to have expectations. I learned it entirely from Buddhism, and I always give it credit for that. But that answer to the problem of suffering, I reject it. Anyway, I'm not in touch with the guy I was or the woman I was in the last life. So what good is the lesson? I don't know who I was. I know who I would like to have been, but I don't know who I was. So, wonderful people I know believe in this, but I have to say I don't find it emotionally or morally or intellectually satisfying. So Judaism said we just don't know. Rabbi Milton Steinberg, the author of As a Driven Leaf, started out life as a non-believer in God and then came to believe in God. He is one of the great jewels of American Jewry. He's died many years ago. You read any of his works and you will thank me. Then you'll thank Steinberg. Rabbi Steinberg came up with a brilliant response to this issue. He said, you're absolutely right. The believer in God has to account for suffering. So listen to what he said. Yes, the believer in God has to account for one thing: suffering, unjust suffering. But he has an explanation for everything else. The atheist, on the other hand, has no explanation for anything else. They can explain suffering, perhaps, but how do they explain everything else? And he's right. What is the atheist explanation for everything else? It's either we don't know, one day science will figure it out, or it just happened on its own. I don't find that satisfying. It's funny, I debated, this was one of my favorite days. Sue and I went to Minnesota a number of years ago. I was invited to the annual convention of American, what was it called? U.S. Atheists? Or American Atheists? Anyway, so it's one of the big groups. So it's American Atheists, let's say. And by the way, it was Easter Sunday, and I got up and said, only in America is a Jew invited by atheists on Easter Sunday. And that's true, that's America for you. So anyway, we debated on this issue, and I asked them, I said, would you raise your hand if you ever doubt your atheism? Not one hand went up. Now, isn't that interesting? They're the ones who claim to be open-minded and believe in self-inquiry. Now, if I were to say to this group, raise your hand if you ever have any doubts about God, every hand would go up in this room. Virtually every clergyman I interviewed when I had the show Religion on the Line for 10 years here in LA would have raised his hand, or her hand, as we started to get female clergy by the end. In other words, I said, so wait a minute. So when I see a baby with birth defects and wonder, is there a God? But if you see a baby born who is perfectly healthy and the miracle of birth, you never think for a moment, maybe there is a God. Sperm and egg meet and out comes a human who will produce a symphony, and that's completely natural to you. You can't even imagine maybe there is a God. So who's more open? We do challenge ourselves. You don't. See, I turned the tables around because they deserve to be turned around. And so please understand the brilliance of the Jewry being named struggle with God. Israel struggled with God. I don't like people who believe who never struggle, and I don't like atheists who don't believe and never struggle. The mitzvah is to struggle with God. You can't sit back and say, I don't believe. Not if you're Jewish. You can't. If you take Judaism seriously. You can, obviously, it's a free country. You can do whatever you like. But Judaism does not allow you to do that. It's a commandment to struggle with God and to try to believe. And by the way, let me say on that regard, that just as when I talk about